how great a staff director you are. Most of the work field, mission of this subcommittee. In December, we will complete all the work. So we need a passing for these. At this point, I'd like to turn over to Justin Brown, who guided this discussion.
Morning.
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 So as Pat said, fairly straightforward meeting objectives here. Discuss the topics that we're going to be our next round of projects. And as we get into this, I just want to emphasize that we feel like it's really good when you give us studies in advance. It allows us, frankly, to just be more efficient with our staff. We can put our analysts on those new topics as they're freeing up with their current work, and that's starting to happen now. So the goal this morning is to have a discussion about potential topics, which I'll walk you through in a minute. And these would be topics we start reviewing later this fall and report out next year, 2024. Then we'd spend the time between today and the November JLARC meeting looking more specifically into those topics and drafting study resolutions in cases where it's not already. We present those draft resolutions to the full commission at the November meeting next month, next week reflect your recommendation. So this changes a little bit from year to year, but we think we have capacity to complete at least 5 studies next year. How many we can actually complete, though, it's going to depend on how big each topic is, how complex each topic is. So, for example, if you give us 5 large projects, that could potentially fully utilize our whole staff. But a few large projects and a few smaller ones, we can probably do 6 or more. And there's a bit of a relief valve here. So even if you give us too much, we can certainly start them even next year as our analysts free up, and we can finish them later. But we can deal with that at like the first JLARC meeting next year. I always like to also remind you that if more pressing topics come up, for example, even during the legislative session, you can just give us those new priority topics and we'll just set something aside depending on what else comes up. So you've got some flexibility. So we've got 3 sources for the study topics this year. There we come resolutions referred by House rules for consideration. There's some other topics in JLARC member interest, and then we as staff have some ideas. Definitely want to hear any ideas that you have, if you thought about it ahead of time or have things that come up during the discussion. We'll start with the 3 topics referred by House rules, and that's chaired by Delegate Orrock. The referral was for JLARC to decide whether it wants us as staff to do the review. I'm just going to go in numerical order here. The first referral was a review of funding for Commonwealth's attorneys and clerks of the circuit court, and this was originally paid for by Delegate Ware. The focus will be on the trends and trajectory of general funding, metrics that determine how funding is provided, equity of funding across localities, and how much localities supplement state funding. One note I would make is that we're right now reviewing Commonwealth's attorneys' compensation. So that's part of our review of the public attorney system. So we're going to have some information about that at next month's meeting. And so there'd be some overlap there. I don't think we need to kind of delve into the Commonwealth's attorneys as much as we did this. So this would be a fairly narrow review, focused pretty much just on the clerks. And one thing I'll just tell you, I think you all know this, but even looking at the Commonwealth's attorneys issue, you're kind of getting into local supplements and state funding, and it's just kind of a difficult area. And so you'll see that reflected when we report out the Commonwealth's attorneys information to the member. Doug, I'm not sure if there's anything you want to add to that or anything on this. That was the first resolution. Are there any questions or comments about that particular topic?
Delegate Ware.
I'm not sure how, is this audible now or is it being picked up?
We can hear it, yes.
Okay. Okay. This came to me from several of my localities that had an interest, particularly in the Commonwealth's attorneys and the clerk of courts. Initially, we looked at all of the constitutional officers, but narrowed down because there were several of those that either the localities have operated differently and so on. So ultimately we narrowed it to these 2, and that's the derivation of it. The House rules seem to think it was worth a review. It's been I think it's a couple of years ago this came through.
Get further discussion on this item.
So the second referral is to review the cost of higher education, finding ways to make it cheaper. It's actually papered by Byron. This resolution is pretty similar to one we did a lot of work on. In higher education too. Worked on for 2 years, had 5 teams on it. So big deal for the agency. This is a little broader, it includes 17 items specifically to look at. And I'd also note that earlier this year we different packets, kind of urging to make this work. Added a little bit of a different focus in addition. And, as I said, I do think the environment changed. Certainly compared to 10, 11 years ago. But there's some similarities there. The other thing I just wanted to make you aware of, I touched base with the administration weeks ago. They have been pretty involved in the 6-year planning process for all the institutions. And I think the work they're doing this dovetail pretty nicely. This would be a big project, probably. We count this as 2.
Discussion on this topic.
Chairman?
Oh, you will.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So you mentioned the study 10 years or so ago. Do you feel like that this update, if you will, would be kind of just that, an update, kind of working off of what you did then?
It's a good question. I think it's been long enough that it would be a different project. However, a lot of the information and approaches that we use to kind of assess the cost structure of the institutions, the change in tuition and federal funds, we know how to, I live back then, so we know how to do that. So we get a big jump start, I think, on doing the project. But I was chatting with Chairman Pike a few minutes before the meeting, and I do think after the pandemic and then the fact that I think students are starting to figure out that borrowing a lot of money and going to a 4-year institution maybe isn't always the best choice. And so there are some colleges when you look at some of the enrollment patterns that you're seeing some differentiation. And one of the things that the speaker's letter kind of focuses on is that kind of change in enrollment patterns. And I think that it's a fundamentally different environment for higher education. So I think we get a head start because we know how to do it, but because it's 10 years later, I think it's worth doing.
Any other comments or questions on this item? I would also submit to this committee also that, I think all of us have probably heard based on that enrollment. I've probably modified some of the language of this resolution. I think one of the things I've heard that is pressing is where we have smaller institutions with declining enrollment, the cost share of capital burden to enrollment ratios for. And there's a handful of I think universities around Virginia that are sort of the mega universities that have, I think, a more immediate consideration of the financial fiscal stability. There's also impacts to the surrounding communities as well, whether it be Bradford, Longford, despite half a dozen plus universities across Virginia that are experiencing enrollment declines. And I think that some of the fiscal stability and or how the state funds, I think, surprised some questions that warrant and some historically underfunded areas that are also would need to be addressed. So I think my recommendation would be to take a look at how we tackle the most pressing issues as a part of this as a primary question, as a suggestion.
To that point, I think one thing we could do is just and we can do with all of these, we will take this discussion. I think we could kind of tailor and cater what we put in front of each next month to improve. We can actually look specifically at what we're talking about. I think it's the original resolution, the speaker's letter, and just kind of our basic knowledge of higher education put together.
Mr. Chairman. So to your point, so am I hearing your concern is that some of these institutions have taken on projects, if you will. And, you know, if it could come to we start reshuffling the deck on funding and so forth, that they're left holding the bag in the kind of middle of the game. So is that your concern?
I would say that that would be one of the concerns. I think it's also, it's a part of this, I suggest we look at what North Carolina and other competing folks sport students are doing. Because I think the climate has changed the past few years since the last study in terms of how they structure tuition, what those incentives are for smaller universities, all cross border, what are the other dynamics that are driving sort of the tier of university side. I'm not sure the prior studies have really updated to this context. I think there's some important dynamics that are going on.
Delegate, just to circle back on your point also. I think there's maybe 4 to 6 schools, you know, and all these places are frankly business. So they have kind of based on their ability to increase tuition and or the ability schools in the Commonwealth that are able to do that. World, they have tuition, they're fine. There are some the underlying assumptions I think we're starting to kind of deteriorate. So that forces you to then take the underlying cost structure. That's
Mr. Chairman, Justin, would you sort of categorize your study based on size, large, medium, small institutions?
I think we would. You know, it's always interesting whenever you do higher education work. There's 15 publics, and they will all tell you they're completely different from each other. But I do think that size is a way to categorize it. There's something nationally called Carnegie classifications that group schools, particularly by whether they do research or don't do research. Jeff also has a kind of classification grouping, and I do think it's important to look at all of them, but you need to think about them in some logical size, pricing power, whether they do research, whether they don't. So that's one of the things we do early in the study, and that's what we did in the one we did a decade ago. We put them in the groupings. I think that's important.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, follow up. Justin, I've heard, and I don't know this to be fact, but I think it is, that some of our North Carolina competing universities are offering free tuition for athletics. And, you know, certain athletic programs have gotten very profitable for institutions of a greater size. And I think I would be interested to know if we, Virginia, are intending to potentially go down that path to remain competitive in athletics. I think we need to be informed of that situation.
We can definitely add that.
Thank you.
Make sure my kid practices basketball.
Yeah, exactly.
Any other comments or questions on this item before we move on?
The third and final referral was of a Senate resolution. That was actually patroned by Senator Lucas, and this would involve us looking at moving the Department of Juvenile Justice out of the Public Safety Secretariat and into the Health and Human Resources. And I think this would definitely be an example of a narrow, relatively small project that, depending on what else you give us, this probably would not count against that quota of 5. I think this would be a fairly narrow topic. Thoughts or questions on that?
Any questions on this item? Any comments?
Next grouping. So we've just kind of informally received some interest from individual JLARC members, and we want to definitely put those on the slide as well. The first of these would be a review of the VCU health system. There's obviously been a lot of coverage in the media about that $73 million cancer building project. I do know that the administration's been pretty involved in looking into that canceled project, and I think it recommends changes, and there's been some look into that already. There's also been some anecdotal concerns, just I think generally about how well that health system is being operated and how that may be affecting health services in the Richmond area. It's not typical for us to look at kind of a single relatively small entity that's kind of just local or regional in nature. But from time to time, the commission has, over our history, asked to do these kind of narrowly focused things. But that was one area that we've heard from a couple of members that they were interested in the topic. Any thoughts or questions about that?
Any comments, questions on this item? We need some more coffee here, Justin.
Yeah.
We're getting there. I'm waiting on the sugar to hit some of these folks here.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, I do have a comment on this one. I think it is important that we do it. It's highly followed by the press. And I think we need to get really accurate information about what's going on there. And there's problem, in my mind, there is some problem with the governance structure of the health system.
Thank you. Another member idea was to review the state's overall policy. Certainly up in Northern Virginia, it's become a prominent industry. We review data center incentive and do that as part of our ongoing. So we have some knowledge about that. And I think there's fairly well-known issues that are, I think, largely local. But you hear concerns from zoning and siting in the centers, environmental impact in terms of electricity usage and waste. So one idea here would be to kind of just learn more about this topic under the broader, notion of our ongoing work, and maybe it's something that could build off our existing knowledge of data centers. But if it got bigger, I think that's something that we maybe have to think about dedicating. So that one, I think, would kind of depend on specific focus and the specific size of it, but we do have a knowledge base about it.
Any comments, questions about the project?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Justin, for me, this one is very important on several different levels. One is the effect of these burgeoning centers on our grid that affects everything else, and the capacity that we have to produce the energy that these centers gobble up wherever they are. I think it has a very significant potential impact for us as if we continue to see Virginia, it seems to be continuing as a growth center worldwide. But that has tremendous effects on just the average citizen's energy availability. And I do think separate from that is what is the impact on localities that accept these, and how does that affect their tax circumstance? What's the appropriate framework that way?
Other comments and questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I would, following up on Delegate Ware's comment, I would be interested to see what the return is. Do we get machinery tools tax, or what the benefiting values are to the locality monetarily with these data centers? I think that's, and I do think they have an impact on the grid, and there are quite a bit of noise concerns where we locate them from the chillers that are required to maintain the constant temperature in the facility with the heat generated. So probably an interesting subject matter to discuss. Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions on this? I'll just add to this discussion. I agree with some of the comments that I made. Obviously, data centers are an important center of job and economic importance in Virginia based on its growth. The local zoning context interface, I think, with the power transmission also is an important context, because one decision made in the next, we've had different bills over the years, as you know, with undergrounding power lines and different community impacts. And I'm not sure what the right answer is, but I think it's a difficult one. That's why we pay you guys the big bucks, is to roll up the sleeves and dig in. But there's probably some coordination with some other bodies that also coexist in terms of local government realm of how we create a context that deals with power generation, but also transmission, availability, appropriateness, other impacts, while still not stymieing necessarily an industry that's obviously Virginia is one, if not the leading location in the world. But to make sure we get this right and still understand its full impacts.
Mr. Chairman, I have a follow-up, please.
Delegate Austin.
We've entertained some of these at MEI, and I certainly don't want this study to discourage or to imply that Virginia is not interested in data centers. What we at MEI have done is suggest that they not concentrate these in our major growth areas. There's a lot of open space and a lot of real estate throughout the Commonwealth that these could be situated or located that would probably not have the effects that it does in certain areas. So maybe some siting criteria would be good, or what would be considered as an adequate or appropriate site for a data center.
Justin, I think we just nominated you as a planning commissioner for Commonwealth of Virginia. So good luck with that.
Yeah, based on our housing study, we should like it. So, I mean, you all know this, but it's some of these things, it's hard for the state to kind of. And we'll think about this. Whenever I hear the zoning, it worries me. What can you do? That idea about the criteria and then kind of thinking a little bit, okay, okay, put these somewhere else. And have it be a strategy for others.
Without setting a tone that we're not interested.
Correct.
That's my fear. But thank you.
I'll just add one more to Delegate Austin's comments. I mean, worldwide, there are different models that are urbanized data center models, believe it or not. There are rural, there's all sorts of different fits that do things differently and have a little bit different standards and might be worthy of also is they're different. We provide incentives as a Commonwealth. Are there different criteria or for meeting the highest mark to achieve sort of some of the tax credit? I'm just throwing it out there with different models of incentives, and we put quite a bit of incentive on the table as the Commonwealth. So something for the group to certainly think about, and certainly does on MEI to think about as well. It might be a good tool.
Mr. Chairman, as you know, all these are very competitive, and we have to incentivize to get these industries. So sometimes we have no choice based on the value that these projects bring. So once again, I just don't want to imply that we are discouraging. So thank you.
Thank you. Final member idea, at least that we've heard of in advance, is to do a little bit of work on transportation. And I chatted with Senator McPike about this a little earlier. We did a pretty big review of transportation policy back in 2021. There's some additional topics related to polling policy across the state, some of the really large long-term contracts for congestion reduction, also some kind of concern or interest around the prioritization of projects and whether that's actually adequately addressing some of the real hotspots for congestion. Depending on how this is framed out, I think this is something that, like, we've already done a little bit of research on, and we could probably just keep doing a little bit of research on, and maybe not even package a full JLARC report. If there's more interest in transportation that y'all want to talk about this morning, I think we can broaden it out. But based on kind of the specific questions, I think this is something we could probably cover with our existing folks and not have to be a full-blown JLARC stuff. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Comments and questions on this?
Mr. Chairman, I could probably keep house staff busy for about 10 years on this subject matter. We're looking for ways to improve Interstate 81, and we just looked at the potential of a managed lane that would be a toll-only lane on Interstate 81 as a means by which to accomplish. The cost today is about $35 million per mile to add a lane, and we have currently 58 or 59 lane miles. When we finish the project that we have funded in 2019 legislation, we'll have about 89 lane miles. We have a need for about 640 total lane miles. So if you take today's dollars at $35 million a mile, that's $19 billion to improve Interstate 81. So, I think we have to be creative, innovative, and try to plan for how we're going to manage and improve. And in today's Highway Transportation Trust Fund, with the mileage going up and the efficiency of automobiles on the miles per gallon, we're collecting less revenue. And so we have a serious problem that I don't see an end solution to. And so therefore we got to be, this study would be very valuable to inform as to what some options are, I think. And what some of our P3s, what have been some of the benefits of P3s, what have been some of the controversial issues that P3s have created, and how could we better draft a P3 to regulate the tolls and the cost to serve the Commonwealth. So,
Other comments or questions on the side? I'll just add to that, to what Delegate Austin said. I think there's an important context of lessons learned from some of the infrastructure that we do have. I can tell you from some of my constituents, we have 66 and 95. There's actually different rules of the road and different fine structures. And if you drive from one to the other, it's not necessarily apparent, especially to small businesses. I had one that had tens of thousands of dollars of fines from one section of road, but not from the other. And you know, that can be frustrating when you see that. The other big complaint that we get is also, you know, the Occoquan River Bridge bottleneck. You can't improve it because of the contract with the hot lanes. That's a compensable event. And so even though you go from 5 lanes down to 3 lanes, you don't need to be a traffic engineer to say like the New York to Florida traffic is going to bottleneck right there. The last VDOT report shows 2 million hours lost per year at that point. So that couple mile stretch. And you know, some of that P3 infrastructure prohibits it unless we pay. And so I think there's some important lessons learned of how do we deal with what we have, but how do we also plan for the future? So there are some pretty big questions.
Just to, you know, this better than I do, I'm sure, but we looked a little bit into some of those contracts, and there's a few that are, you know, 70+ years into the future, and there are very specific events that the vendor has to be compensated. Now, one just it's a little bit like some of the local zoning issues. I think the lessons learned context can be very useful. Obviously, those contracts have been signed, and kind of doing anything about that is, I think, is not possible necessarily. But I think so this broader notion of kind of P3s, congestion reduction, we can think about that between now and
Senator Allen.
Well, I've been sitting here very quiet, having endured the Dulles toll for, oh, I don't know, 25 years or whatever. But in your lessons learned, please do look at that toll road. From Dulles into DC, but also the extension that's now there.
good lessons learned.
Big lessons to be learned.
Thank you.
Justin, I think caffeine and sugar. We're starting.
Yeah, a little bit of a delay. That's kind of we were remembering getting. So, one thing I just didn't want to jump past, and you know, but I always like to take a pause for a minute. What we just talked about were things we heard of, but I want to give you all a chance. There's other things that have been on your mind or come to you during this meeting about agencies, programs, policy areas. Interested in that as well.
Any items on this for folks to add to the discussion this morning?
Move to the last bucket here, and these are just some ideas we have, you know, state government, and usually around this time of year we kind of look back across some of our recent work and experience with staff, see if there's things. Generally, I think there's kind of 3 topics to discuss. The first one would be a review of the Department of Health. And you know, it's interesting when I give them a list of all the agencies never reviewed that. The health department would spending a long time. So you know, it's a large department, a lot of different state and local programs, a lot of federal funding, but there's also some really critical programs state as well. And I guess more broadly, you know, obviously this was an agency that was front and center during the pandemic. Leadership changes, you know, So in the abstract, the agencies with those characteristics, I think, are good candidates for an external entity like JLARC to just come and just take a management review of how is the agency functioning, having gone through such a difficult period. And there's some very important programs, depending on how we did it and how you wanted us to break it out. We could do a kind of a management review and then look at some of the specific programs. And this, I think this one would be like the higher ed one potentially, not quite as big, but depending on what else you give us and what you're interested in, if there is interest, we could maybe even break this up into a couple of projects that we do. So that's one idea. I'll pause just for a second in case anybody else wants the question.
Any comments on? All right.
Second topic, this would need to be fleshed out a little bit more, but this really comes from us just kind of routinely encountering agencies that frankly don't operate in the most effective and efficient way possible. Almost all of our recent projects, and you have heard us tell you about them, have at least one, sometimes more, large, big, transformational project that just did not go the way it was supposed to go. And it's a problem for constituents or customers of that agency. It's a problem for the agency internally. And I think part of this would be just from kind of the business process reengineering side and IT side. Is the state kind of equipped to do projects well? And is it thinking about them in a smart way, including people? So that would be one part of this. I think there's also some pretty mixed approaches we've seen across state government in terms of succession planning, in terms of making sure that the physical footprint that these agencies have now, especially coming out of the pandemic, is kind of smart and efficient. So this is something we could think about more, but if the idea of kind of looking at the way the state government thinks about kind of being nimble during a crisis and effective and efficient and leveraging the best of the private sector, if that's intriguing, think about it. Come back to something. So the third and final idea would be to check in on the pretty massive broadband efforts that are going on right now. Clear getting broadband folks that still don't have it is really important for economic development, and to give those folks in areas, relatively level playing field. I think that's obviously a big important topic. There are billions of dollars in funding that are allocated for this, and a lot of it's federal funding. We looked into this a little bit. There's a lot of players. There's a legislative group that's involved. There's state and local government. You have utilities, private sector more broadly. So the idea here would be to focus on rural areas to see how those efforts are going, what the end game is in terms of the final outcome, and how once all this winds down, make sure that it's effective and there's that handoff back off of how it's supposed to work. I mentioned that there's a lot of groups. There's the Broadband Advisory Council, which has legislators on it. So I think there's the need to kind of coordinate effectively across all these different groups, I think would be part of this as well. So, given that there's some legislative interest in this, we'd obviously work to not duplicate any other efforts that are going on, but that's another idea. Broadband.
Comments or questions on this item? Delegate Word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say that particularly in the rural areas that I represent, there's no higher level of interest on a topic than this one for all the reasons: public safety, economic development, student learning outcomes. All those things are implicated in this, and I think you put your fingers on it. It's been a huge influx, a ramp up of funding available, but how it's being implemented, whether there's even sufficient contracting available to do the build out, all the elements of this are I think are certainly worth consideration because of their impact on the ordinary citizen.
Mr. Chairman.
Delegate also.
I think this is very, very worthy of a study. I think what we're going to find is that we're not going to accomplish what we had hoped to accomplish because of inflation and sourcing of materials and the availability of personnel to perform the work. I've just spoken with some individuals over the weekend. One of the co-ops that's doing some of the work says we're not going to be able to accomplish what we were planning to accomplish. I think it's worthy. I think it's going to be disappointing, but I think we certainly have to look at it, and we're going to, I think, find out that there's going to be a lot left to accomplish when we complete our task with what we've been appropriating funds to do. So I think it's worthy.
Other comments? All right.
All we're asking you to do at this point is just give us the okay to draft some study resolutions, which we'll bring to the full commission next month. I've kind of been trying to keep track along the way. But Mr. Chairman, you may just take off what we think.
Yeah, I was gonna say if we can provide staff with some direction, if you want to go through the list, and circling back to the health department study, that would be one of the agencies in your normal course of review of taking an agency to review.
Yes.
Or is that a part of the 5?
No, I think
we
that
we
would
collectively
definitely count
understand.
towards the 5, even if a light touch on that would be hard. So that would count as the 5. I think that's a big complex thing.
All right, let's go through your list and then we'll compare notes and try to give you some direction today. Of,
Well, so
what
I
to bring
had
back for December.
yes. So I heard interest in higher education. I heard interest in VCU health, in data centers, in transportation, but I think we need to round that out to occupy a full team. But interest in kind of polling strategies, lessons learned, congestion reduction. I heard interest in broadband. And there was some discussion about whether we could do the health department for free, and that will probably count against the total. So, yeah. Did that jive with what you guys?
But by my count, that's 5. So I don't know. I think you got all of it on your plate. That's it.
And we can, if there's something where you just kind of want us to look into, I mean, we can, between now and our November, we can draft up a few more. So 5 is the minimum. But again, that higher ed one and definitely the health department one could be bigger.
I think that's, Mr. Chairman, there's subcommittee. I think that would give us 6 by my count. If you include health, you
Can you
include
say
health
the
as one.
transfer of DJJ Health and Human Resources?
But I think that would be, I think we could probably handle the capacity to do those 6, I think.
Mr. Chairman.
Better luck.
The transfer of DJJ to Health and Human Resources.
If there's interest in that, would we have to do it?
Delegate Will.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Back on page 5, the first one on those 3 highlighted ones was you mentioned the Commonwealth funding for Commonwealth attorneys and clerks of circuit court. You said you're already doing one on Commonwealth attorney.
That's right.
Can we throw the stuff for the clerks we throw that in as a bonus?
Well, I think in terms of the bonus so the Commonwealth's attorney one, that's part of a big review we have of the public attorney system, including court appointed attorneys and public defenders. So we're finalizing that now. So
Right.
it's too late to do that, but I think if we could do some work and some thinking just on the clerks, if you're comfortable with that is something.
Mr. Chairman, I would say that in appropriations this year, we covered some deficiencies in funding for the clerks that we had overlooked last year. So, you may find that we've caught them up substantially.
That's something we could look into between that. See what,
Please
I've
do.
done no research.
Yeah, we
can just see.
did allocate some funding for their needs that we did not incorporate last year. So they have been funded. It's in the budget.
Okay, so we can maybe look into that.
Thank you.
Other comments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering why we would limit it to clerks of the circuit court and not do all clerks. There's been quite a bit of discrepancy in the way they're treated over the years. And I've never been able to wrap my mind around why there's that discrepancy other than that's always been there.
Well, the other thing, when we look into this, we can give some thought to that.
Okay.
Typically, I think there, at least in certain parts of the budget, they're dealt with together. So I'll look at that.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe
That's when we're expanding the list rapidly. So,
Well,
Feel like
at this
we're-
point, that's great. We're. Excellent. Creating new problems. So far, I think it's a good list. So. I don't have what we need unless it's in the business you want to cover.
Well, yeah, thank you, Justin, for the presentation. And I think we'll certainly, once we get some revised resolution language and other thoughts from you, have the opportunity to circle back with some of the topic subcommittee members. Provide, I think, a little bit more clear direction of recommendations for adoption for the December meeting. It would be helpful.
I think it would be good. Excellent. Thank you.
Any other business? All right. Committee will adjourn.
8 minutes.